Hello, I'm Dudley Anderson. Welcome to The Reality. Today in The Reality, we meet evangelist David Hathaway. David Hathaway is founder of the ministry Eurovision and editor of the widely distributed magazine Prophetic Vision. David began working in Russia and Eastern Europe in 1961 when he organized the first ever expedition from Great Britain to Jerusalem by road through the old Iron Curtain countries. Out of this experience, David began smuggling Bibles into the USSR until in 1972 he was arrested and imprisoned in Czechoslovakia.
My job was the dangerous part. What I had to do was drive up with the tourists, drive up to the hotel, have dinner, and then when they were asleep, go out, take the bus at about 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning to a secret rendezvous, open it up, distribute the Bibles, pass them over to the Christians, get back, get into bed, pretend I'd been in bed all night.
Having been to Israel many times, David has built up a relationship with Russian Holocaust survivors. So I began our chat with David Hathaway, asking him about his work with these dear people. Today's The Reality was recorded in front of a live audience.
I studied the stories, you know about the Holocaust, but I think it's too distant for us to actually realize the horror of it. But I visited over the years, over the last 50 years, I've visited many of the death camps. And I'm only too aware of what happened. I've been in Auschwitz several times. I've been in Buchenwald. I've been in so many of them. And for me to attempt to speak to these Holocaust survivors, I said it's impossible. These Jewish people, they were prepared to, they were going to die for their faith in God. And how could I speak to them about the same God? Because after all, it's the one God. Our God is the God of Israel. It's the Jewish God. And how could I tell them that this God who'd allowed so many to die, how could I speak to them about love and forgiveness? Because, the real Christian message, the most key central point of the Christian message is actually forgiveness. And I was so absolutely desperate. I read the stories of these. I read the story of one of the Holocaust survivors. It was a harrowing story. He was from Krakow in Poland, from the ghetto. And he tells the story how he was 12 years old and he was taken with his mother, his father, and his baby sister, put on the train to take them into Auschwitz. They arrived at the station, got out of the train. And because he, as a 12-year-old boy, looked quite strong and his father was not so old, they were put into the work camp. But his mother and his baby sister were taken straight to the furnace to be burnt. Jesus. And the shock of that, never to see them again. And then also in the camp to see his father die. He survived. It's a miracle, possibly because he was young at the time. Some of them did survive. But to hear those stories and meet those people, how can I speak to them about the love of God, forgiveness of the God that saw them die? And I questioned. In the end, I said, why? Why will you listen to me? And then they said 2 reasons. One is because we know that you were in a communist prison. I was sentenced to 10 years in a communist prison. I said, but the communist camps were nothing compared to the Holocaust. Oh no, they said. The Russian camps were actually worse than the German Holocaust. Well, when you realize that Stalin was responsible for the massacre of 95 million people. And so if you talk about 6 million in the German death camps, you begin to understand. So they said, David, if you survived one of our camps, then we will listen to you. Wow. The other thing is this, if this Jesus you talk about is alive, because the Jews don't accept Jesus. And they said, if you're going to talk to read from your Christian Bible and talk to us about Jesus, then we have to have the evidence that the Jesus you talk about is the Jesus of the Bible. I said, what evidence? They said, well, he healed the sick, didn't he? And he's going to heal us. But we're not talking about ordinary people. We're talking about people my age and older who had survived the Holocaust with every kind of disease and sickness. And I never forget that first meeting. It's only about 6 years ago. And I said to them afterwards, I said, well, did God do the miracles? Oh, they said, we're amazed. We never expected to see so many miracles. And you know, the most precious thing I have in my office, do you know what they did to celebrate? And as a thank you gift, they produced a large picture. And it's a picture of the people that died in the Holocaust. Well, some of them. And superimposed on it by these people were the pictures of the people miraculously healed. Out of death came life. So you understand that I've established a relationship with these people. Eventually, after a few meetings, one of the men came to me. He was the head of the organization of Holocaust survivors. This man he's the head of the organization, a colonel in the KGB, colonel in the Russian army, not a believer, a Jew, but not a believer. And the interesting thing is that he announced publicly from the platform, all my people must hear the words of this preacher, because it brings life out of death.
David Hathaway's love for Russian Jewish Holocaust survivors developed as a result of his trip to Jerusalem from London by road.
This was 1961. At the time, I was a young evangelist in England, and I'd heard that for the first time for 2,000 years, that Christians from around the world were going to have a meeting in Israel. Israel was a new country. It was only 13 years old. Israel was born in 1948. This was 1961. And there was going to be a conference of people from around the world who were going to meet in Jerusalem and celebrate the day of Pentecost. Boy, oh boy, that's exciting, because the day of Pentecost is when God sent fire on the early church. And I was determined I was going to be there, and I had no money. What was I going to do? Well, it was about £150 in those days. I mean, it'd be £1,500 today. I didn't have any £150. I'd just got married recently. I'd got 2 young babies, not very old. I was an evangelist. And how was I going to go? Well, if I couldn't raise the £150, I thought about it, and I prayed about it, and I turned to the team that worked with me. I said, hey guys, look, I said, it's very easy to get to Jerusalem. We don't need to fly. Why don't we take a car? You know, I've got a car. Why don't we jump in the car and drive there? As you nothing. Do. Yes. It's the return trip is only it's 6,500 miles, 10,000 kilometers. That's nothing. And so the idea was born from that. Of course, when eventually I put it to the other members of the team that I was serious, they all found excuses. One said, well, I've got married, I can't go. The other said, I've just bought a car, I can't go. The other said, I can't go anyway. And not one of them would go. The thing is that having said I would go, I must go. It took me 2 years to organize. It was impossible. We weren't allowed to take women. We had 3 problems. One, we wouldn't get permission to go through the communist countries. That was the route. If we went through Turkey, we'd be murdered. If we went to Syria, we'd be shot as spies. And having got into Israel, we were not allowed to come out. So it was impossible, wasn't it? Mm. Well, I prayed into it. I believe God does answer prayer. And I was praying. I said, oh, God, if you want me to go, you're going to have to make it possible. So it ended up that we found a way. I got the visas. 9 of us went. And I tell you, it only cost us £49.50 each.
Goodness.
1/3 of the 150. But I found somebody who would help me to get a new minibus to go. We'd set off in a new minibus. We'd go in an old one, not that journey. And we got permission to go through the Iron Curtain, through Yugoslavia, through Bulgaria, almost 1,000 miles across Turkey. We went all the way down through Syria, all the fighting in Syria. We went through across the border. Aleppo was the first place we stayed. Went down through Homs, Hama, Damascus, and into Jordan, then across the Mandelbaum Gate into Israel, and then came out by sea. It took me 2 years of praying and organizing to do it by road. If I'd just simply said, please God, give me £150, it would have been a lot simpler. Yeah. But you see, if I'd had the £150, I wouldn't be sitting in this chair.
Right.
Because the whole of my ministry came out of that.
But of course, David, going right through the eastern bloc of Europe, the Soviet countries, through the old Iron Curtain, that must have been an experience in itself. And then you ventured to smuggle Bibles in behind the Iron Curtain. Why did you start doing that?
Well, it all came out of that first journey because we had to go through Yugoslavia, which was, we always used to say Yugoslavia was a little bit pink, not red. But Bulgaria was reckoned to be more difficult, harder than Russia itself. And when we went in on that first trip, the 9 of us, we were arrested and put in a prison camp overnight. And they monitored you. They timed us. You were not allowed to deviate from your course. The prison camp is still there. I mean, they published my book in Bulgarian because they all know the truth of all the stories, and they wanted to see the book, and because the places that I referred to are still there. So it really was an experience of going behind the Iron Curtain. Of course, they allowed us out of the camp, but we were told we mustn't deviate from a route that we had given. If we deviated, we did deviate, of course, because I'm not that obedient. So, yes, so we then came out the other side and crossed into Turkey. But that first trip, when I came back, of course, my wife actually said, that's it, I've let you go once, that's the end. But it wasn't. Because, first of all, I was on television because I was the first person in history ever to make the overland crossing. Cambridge University did it after me. And I was inundated with letters from people who wanted to go. So I had to make a second trip. That time I took 3 buses. And that created more publicity. So I then had to buy a bus. And eventually it became a travel company. I had a fleet of buses going. We're going 8 times a year with a fleet of buses. I can remember traveling with one of my buses, and in Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, you pick up a communist guide, and that guide has to travel with you to make sure you don't do anything, don't talk to people, you don't do anything. And I remember on that particular trip that the guide, a young girl, and she was saying, this is what I have to tell you, every person here in Bulgaria under communism, they've got access to the most luxurious hotels. When we bring the English miners across, we show them how miners would live in this country and put them up in the Hilton Hotel and show them the luxury. And she said, every person, under communism has a home, there are no homeless. But when she discovered it was a British bus and there were no microphones on it, she said, all right, now I'll tell you the truth. She said, when I'm supposed to tell you that every person under communism has a home, it simply means that 4 families will share 1 room separated only by curtains. 4 families in 1 room. And this joke about putting the miners up in the Hilton Hotel, oh yes, we did. But they are the only people who ever stayed in it. None of us ever stayed in it except the communist elite. But it wasn't that. It was what I discovered was the persecution of the Christians. terrible persecution. And I discovered there I was in Bulgaria, taking these tourists through, and yet at the same time, pastors and people were imprisoned and dying. Eventually I was to meet some of them and to learn the stories of how they would be imprisoned just simply because they were pastors of churches. They would be 14 years, one of them 14 years, another one 21 years in prison, how they were not allowed a Bible. And eventually talking to this guide about Jesus, at the end of the journey, she said to me, David, she said, can you give me a Bible? Well, I had a New Testament I gave her. And I said, look, I'll give it to you on one condition. Now, normally, we don't have the same guide both ways. In fact, we won't ever have the same guide twice, although she was working. I said, look, if I give you this Bible, it's on condition. I'll be coming back. I'm taking the group out to Israel, and then I shall be back in 10 days with a different group. I said, if I give you this Bible, I want you to meet me on the way back. Okay, she said, no problem. So we went, dropped off those tourists, and by then we were taking tourists both ways, brought the tourists back, met her at the border coming in from Turkey into Bulgaria. She traveled with us through to the hotel, stayed overnight, and over dinner she began to talk to me. I said, well, how did you like that Bible I gave? It was a New Testament. Oh, she said, you know, as a tour guide, I work from 7 o'clock in the morning till 12 o'clock at night with you guys. You know, I've had no time for reading in these last 10 days. Well, I said, did you read anything? Well, she said, I'm sorry, all I read in 10 days was Matthew, Mark, and I'm halfway through Luke. She thought she had to read the whole New Testament in 10 days.
Oh, bless. Fantastic, isn't it?
And she said, oh, this is absolutely fantastic, she said. But it's in English. She said, I know English, but oh, what I'd love to have is a Bible in my own language. Oh, I said, it's no problem. I pulled some Bulgarian money out. I said, there you are. I said, go and buy one. She said, don't be crazy. She said, there aren't any Bibles. There's no way we can buy a Bible anywhere, not one Bible anywhere in Bulgaria. She said, the only way is if you bring me one. So what I did was I came back from the British and Foreign Bible Society. We got any Bulgarian Bibles? Oh, yes, we've got a few. I said, send me half a dozen. And they arrived. So I threw them in the back of the bus. Didn't hide them, nothing. Just threw them in the back of the bus. Forgot about them. Picked her up. We travelled to the hotel that night. And she was so angry with me. Well, I asked you to bring me a Bible. And if you'd got it, you would have given it to me now. I said, so she said, you forgot. Anyway, she said, look, I've been talking about this Jesus to the other guides and to my sister, and they all want to know about Jesus, and they all want Bibles. I said, how many do you need? She said, well, at least 6. Well, that was the number I had.
Yes. Amazing.
And that was the beginning.
Fantastic.
And that's how I began. Bible smuggling. But of course, being British, I realized you don't take in 6 Bibles in a suitcase, which is what people were doing up to then. You do it on a commercial scale. So what I did was I converted one of my buses and built a compartment in it that would take 2 tons of Bibles. 2 tons is 5,000 Bibles, 12,000 New Testaments, or 100,000 Gospels. And every time we traveled behind the Iron Curtain, that's what we carried.
Then it didn't all go terribly smoothly, because there was a place where things got a bit difficult, didn't it?
Well, it got difficult a few times. I would keep here all day if I were to tell you how many times it got difficult.
But you ended up then in a Russian prison?
Yes, eventually somebody made a mistake. I was sent through the wrong border. We worked with a team. I didn't work alone. I had a proper team. It was a highly sophisticated operation. My job, basically, was the dangerous part. I had to get them across the border, and then I would be met by Christians in the country, and we had to unload the Bible, and believe me, that was the 2 most dangerous points were crossing the border, discovery, and then when the Bible was vulnerable, when we had to open it up and take them out. But we then passed them over to the Christians there, who then finally distributed them. because I had to do that in the middle of the night. What I had to do was drive up with the tourists, drive up to the hotel, have dinner, and then when they were asleep, go out, take the bus at about 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning to a secret rendezvous, open it up, distribute the Bibles, well, pass them over to the Christians, get back, get into bed, pretend I'd been in bed all night.
What was it like for you as a British citizen in a Russian prison?
Appalling. It wasn't actually in Russia. I was arrested in Czechoslovakia with the Russian Bibles. They were on the way to Russia. This was after the Six-Day War in Israel. The Six-Day War closed the route for my buses into Israel. And I was shocked. I had a fleet of buses. I had a business. We were working with the Christians there. But suddenly it was all disrupted. Mm-hmm. And so in 67 was a major turning point for me. In 67, I had to divert my buses and use just a couple of them for part of the journey to Israel, because sometimes we took people down into Italy and put them on a ship and so on. Mm-hmm. But basically, I was now using my buses to take tourists all over the communist countries. And the thing which you've got to understand, look, it's difficult for you because the Cold War and the days of the Iron Curtain, I mean, the generation growing up now doesn't even know what you mean by the Iron Curtain. But the fact was that to be arrested and put in a prison was a horrendous thing. I mean, they were afraid of us. You don't realize, but working years later in Siberia to find out on the far side of Siberia, the people were told we in the West were going to drop atomic bombs on them. So what I'm saying is, to be in a communist prison, they hated us. The fact that I was a Christian and the fact that I was taking in Bibles, and I was the source of the majority of Bibles going into Russia and the communist countries, because they discovered that they had given me licenses.
Wow.
I mean, if I can tell you how I got the licenses for Romania. Romania was one country they said they never could get Bibles into. Ceausescu and the rest of them, they were so terrible there. So I thought to myself, right, okay, so they say it's impossible. And my Bible says we've got nothing is impossible, so come on, we give it a try. So I filled the bus up with Bibles, took just a small group of my staff with me, you see. And we set off, we got to Bulgaria, got to the border. So they searched me at the border. They didn't find them. They said, why are you here with an empty bus, which is just offer? I said, because I'm intending to run a series of tours to Romania. I'm here to check out the routes, the hotels. Oh, they said, okay. So they let me go through. I got to Bucharest, passed all the Bibles over to the Christians. After I distributed the Bibles and got the bus empty, I went to the Minister for Tourism in Bucharest. I said, what do you think you're doing? Look, here I am. I'm British. I've got these buses. They're my own buses. And I said, I'm going to be bringing tourists through here to Bulgaria, to the Black Sea. And you stop my buses at the border and you keep us there for 3, 4, 5 hours while you search them. I refuse to bring tourists through if you're going to treat them like this. How can we expect our tourists to spend these hours at the border while you search our buses? Do you want tourism or not? And the poor minister apologized. He said, tell me about your buses. They were blue and white, the Israeli colors. I said, the British buses, British built. You can't make any mistake with them. All right, he said, Mr. Hathaway, I'll make sure when your buses come through, you're not searched at the borders and you'll have freedom to come through. So when we came to the border of Romania, the bus would stop, you see. I'd get off, the driver would be on, and so the customs and the border police would come on, and after they checked the visas, then they would turn to the Christians and say, do you have any guns? They would laugh. Have you any drugs? They laughed. Have you any Bibles? They didn't know there were 5,000 on there. So they could tell the truth, you see. But they never asked me.
And so David Hathaway smuggled Bibles into ex-Soviet countries for many years, taking God's word to the underground church, who were severely persecuted for their faith by the communist Soviet regime. After serving 1 year in a Soviet prison where he was abused and tortured, David Hathaway's release was negotiated by the then Prime Minister of Great Britain, Harold Wilson. For the years since his release, with the last words of one of his fellow prisoners ringing in his ears, "David, don't forget us," he secretly supported the underground church of the old USSR until eventually, in the 1980s, he began to openly hold services and conferences in that region, a work which has continued to grow and develop until today. David Hathaway's life was touched and changed by the reality of the love of Christ for his children who suffered for their faith behind the old Iron Curtain. And the true reality of this is that Christians around the world are still suffering for their faith. Tens of thousands, no, hundreds of thousands of people are dying and being maimed and losing their property, being ostracized for the sake of the gospel. Jesus calls us to pray for those and support those who are suffering. Listen to a parable that Jesus gave in Matthew chapter 25 from verse 31 to verse 40. "When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all his angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will gather all the nations, and he will separate people one from the other, as a shepherd separates sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. The king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundations of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me.' Then the righteous will answer him and say, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I say to you, as you did it for one of the least of these my brothers, you did it for me.'" You see, Jesus is instructing us to care for those in need, to take care of those in prison, to visit them, to love them, and to support them. Jesus also instructed us to love our enemies and do good to those who persecute us. So indeed, we get angry when children of God are being persecuted for their faith, but we remember that our battle, our fight is not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities of darkness behind these attacks. And so the reality of our story today is to love those who are in prison, caring for those who are being persecuted or ostracized for their faith, and indeed, as tough as it may seem, to love even our enemies. Perhaps God is challenging you today to seek the reality of His purpose for your life. You have been listening to The Reality. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the reality, however, is found in Christ. Today in The Reality, we've heard a story of a life changed for the good, by the reality that is found in Jesus Christ, the way, the truth, and the life. For more information about this radio ministry, please visit dudleyanderson.net. Till next time then, remember that real reality is found only in Christ.